Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Neil, and I'm the Programs and Exhibits Specialist here at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's program is part of our One Book, One Village celebration, a season of events inspired by The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis. Over the past few weeks, we've explored ancient Egypt from many angles: art, architecture, fashion, and museum practices. And now we're turning towards a more unexpected theme: mummies. I'm thrilled to welcome back Dr. Foy Scalf for his second presentation with us. Foy is an Egyptologist and head of the research archives at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago. Tonight, Foy will take us on a fascinating journey from ancient burial practices to modern horror films, tracing how the image of the mummy was transformed by Egyptomania, King Tut's tomb, and pop culture. It's sure to be a lively and eye-opening talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Neil. Very happy to be with all of you tonight. I should also thank Fiona Davis for writing The Stolen Queen, giving us the reason to talk so much about Egyptology for Arlington Heights in over the last few weeks or so. And we're all looking forward to the book program that's coming up for that. As you guys can see on the screen, what we're talking about tonight is what I'd like to refer to as the character, the mummy. And we'll talk more about that terminology in just a second. But you can see here on the screen the quote, "Nothing can stop this monster, nothing." That line, torn from the pages of a 1950s comic book, tells us just about everything we need to know in some ways about how the mummy became a monster. Yet, how did we get there? How did we get to this part where mummies are monstrous horror figures? So today's topic is that background, the background of this character that we all know as the mummy. And what we really want to examine tonight is how this character was influenced through two primary factors. On the one hand, we have ancient Egyptian culture and ancient Egyptian antiquities, which is probably maybe top of mind to some of you about what is one of the influences here. But then also, on the other hand, we have the Victorian Gothic. But not only the Victorian Gothic, but the approach that people during the Victorian period was taking to those ancient Egyptian cultural antiquities. And those common approaches from the 19th and early 20th centuries had a lasting impact on how mummies were presented and viewed. Of course, for the mummy as a character, this sort of image, what you see on the screen, is what a lot of us imagine, especially right now around the time of Halloween. We tend to think of the mummy as a reanimated body, shedding its wrappings, coming to strangle you or to murder you, at least as it's portrayed in most of the mummy movies. In this scene from a pulp comic, which we'll come back to later and discuss some more, we have the mummy approaching, yelling, "Arg!" And then the damsel in distress shrieking, "Get back! Don't touch me!" And there's this nice "aye" in her quote. My favorite part is the quote from this male savior character that you see in the middle as he reads from a magic book. Reading from a magic book is a classic trope of this genre. And he says, "Good Lord, these spells have to work. They must, or else nothing can stop this monster. Nothing." In our discussion today, what we want to examine is the background of these tropes as found in cinema and literature through an analysis of the evolution of the mummy as a character, for whom there is a long literary history and a backstory. To understand that backstory, we need to look at sort of two primary things. First, how ancient Egyptian cultural objects and beliefs were viewed, and second, how they were reinterpreted and very often distorted in the 19th and 20th centuries. For example, early mummy tales were heavily influenced by the trafficking of ancient antiquities, as we will later see. Such literary narratives, themselves influenced by the Victorian Gothic literature, which again we'll come back to, then served as the foundation for the film for the film industry of the early 1900s, which underpinned the pulp comics of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like the one you still see on the screen, and on through to the media of today, shows, movies, literature, even today. In fact, right now, you can go to the grocery store and you're going to see mummies all over the place, from the candy aisle to the magazine rack. So this talk, what I want to talk to you about tonight, will first explore the cultural and historical origins of the mummy figure, So let's call that the mummy you know, and trace its evolution from ancient Egyptian sacred ritual to the appropriations of Victorian fascination and Gothic horror, starting with mummy tales in the early 1800s and then building from there. We'll then examine how these influences coalesced into the pop culture icon we recognize today. So, one thing I want to do is compare these modern constructs against the conceptions of how ancient Egyptians actually viewed the mummified human remains of their ancestors and where those views might clash or overlap with our modern conceptualizations. Then we will sort of conclude and wrap up with some conclusions about how the confluence, the coming together of those factors influenced the mummy character that you know. Now, there are a couple of important points that we need to raise right at the beginning of this talk. First, so fair warning, there are some images of mummified human remains in the slides of this presentation. Now, none of them are super gratuitous, and there are a couple where I've blurred things out, gratuitous or sensational, but rather to illustrate how such remains were treated in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a key component of understanding this background. Part of the issue, as we'll discuss, that is part of the issue of turning the ideas of ancient Egyptian culture about mummified human remains into this Gothic horror character. Part of the issue is objectification, right? So to that end, when I refer to the mummy throughout this talk, I'm referring specifically to the popular character known from literature and film. This is an attempt to avoid, as much as we can, using the word mummy or mummies as a general term to refer to mummified human remains, although there are some exceptions in the talk. We try to avoid that term now because it objectifies those human remains, reducing people to things. As we will see in some of the earliest Egyptological, quote unquote, publications, authors were treating human remains as objects, literally, by calling them antiquities. Thus, they were thought of as objects to collect and study and not the remains of the people that they once were. So right now in our discipline, we're trying to sort of reverse that and think about these ancient people who have mummified remains instead of quote unquote mummies. So when I use the term mummy in a few cases in this talk, largely I'm trying to put it in its historical context to illustrate how people in the 19th and 20th centuries were approaching this cultural material, whether they were visiting Egypt, collecting antiquities, or otherwise, just coming into contact with this material. In that context, we'll see this use of the term mummy. I think it's important to illuminate how the character of the mummy becomes a monster because in ancient Egypt, the mummy didn't exist as a character like ours. The ancient Egyptians had a very different conceptualization of mummified human remains, one that was not monstrous in any real way, and certainly quite the opposite of the Victorian horror Gothic genre. At the heart of this transformation, so from sacred ancestor in ancient Egypt to cinematic monster, is a long history of objectification. Things like treating mummified human remains as collectible curiosities rather than as the bodies of once living individuals. While the ancient Egyptians viewed the mummified body as a sacred vessel for spiritual rebirth, 19th and 20th century people, very often Westerners, increasingly saw it as a specimen, a curiosity, or eventually a source of supernatural horror. Now, we can tie this into Fiona's book. As Fiona Davis dramatizes in The Stolen Queen, the allure of Egypt and its artifacts has long captured the Western imagination, right? Something we often refer to as Egyptomania. This fascination often blurs the line between discovery and possession. That same fascination is what first turned the sacred dead of ancient Egypt into curiosities and then eventually into movie monsters. So the first thing that we want to look at then is this character that we know as, again, the mummy, taking that reference to this character that we know largely nowadays, largely through film. The character came primarily, not only, I should say, it's not only through this, but primarily out of the 1932 film, The Mummy, which really launched a whole series, a whole genre of films, and then spin-offs into other stories. In that film, we have a scene near the very beginning of the movie in which an unwitting archaeological assistant that you can see here, sort of looking quite scared, reads from a scroll, and by reading those magic spells, reanimates the mummy named Imhotep, played in this case by Boris Karloff. Of course, that story then got a reboot much later in the 1990s, which many of the younger generation probably know more through Brendan Fraser in the Mummy films than through the 1932 film. But what you already see in the 1932 film is the idea of reading from a scroll and either activating or deactivating the power of these figures that way. That trope, the trope of sort of a magic scroll that you read from that can either, let's say, unleash the mummy's curse or put the mummy's curse to rest, continues throughout the entire franchise and pretty much all of its spin-offs. Again, even the modern movies since the 1991 remake or 1999 remake and going forward. For example, I love this Web of Mystery cover, which you see here on the screen on the left side, where the mummy has come back and has imprisoned the professor, the scientist who discovered the mummy. The mummy here, notice the quote on the screen, is heckling the professor. He says, quote, "For centuries I have waited for someone to find my tomb. Now you shall take my place, professor, while I've got plans, great plans." One reason I should say that I really love this quote, the quote on the left in this cover, is that an actual copy of this Web of Mystery comic book hung in the office of my former professor at the University of Chicago, whose name was Robert Rittner. He passed away in 2021, but this is a sort of close to my heart. I saw it many days of the week when I was going to class hanging there. But what you're seeing on the screen is just two examples from this large corpus of, again, reanimating the mummy through reading these magic scrolls, and then the mummy coming back as sort of part of this curse. The trope of the reanimated mummy can be found well beyond just those paperbacks and comic books, like the ones that you see here on the screen, all the way to much more diverse materials. So, for example, it is an advertising favorite for snack foods, from Yummy Mummy cereal, which you see on the left, to Cheetos, which you see on the right. So, if you think about this transformation, right, on the one hand, back in ancient Egypt, we had a sacred object, and now we're selling snack food. If that's not a cultural transformation, I don't know what is. So, marketing departments have found, again, this trope about mummies so useful that they use it to grab our attention, even on behalf of our pets, which you see here with mummy wrapped dogs and cats begging for treats. It's literally a trope that's absolutely everywhere, and you find it across our culture. But these tropes about using magical spells to reanimate or deactivate human bodies do have some background, some actual background from ancient Egyptian cultural materials. Modern writers have cherry picked some of these elements to create a hodgepodge of loosely inspired themes that are used in these mummy stories. So, for example, in the beginning of The Mummy from 1932, we see what the film refers to as the Scroll of Thoth, and you see some of the opening credits here. An opening sequence sets the stage, saying, quote, "Herein are set down the magic words by which Isis raised Osiris from the dead," end quote. Now, the so-called Scroll of Thoth shown on the screen was in fact a facsimile of a real papyrus that today is in the British Museum. It belonged to an ancient Egyptian man named Hu-Nefer. You can see the actual papyrus here on the right, a picture of it, and the version from the mummy's opening sequence on the left. And you have certainly heard of papyri like these before by the common name that we use today as the Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. So the film uses, for inspiration, a facsimile of a real ancient papyrus as the quote-unquote Scroll of Thoth. And indeed, ancient Egyptians sometimes referred to this type of papyrus as a Scroll of Thoth. You see here in the center the hieroglyphic copy of Book of the Dead spell number 98. And on the right side, you can see a quote from this, the hieroglyphic quote that refers to the Mejat Net Jehuti, the book, or literally the papyrus scroll of Thoth, as a reference to this type of religious literature. So the opening sequence in the film shows this Book of the Dead facsimile as the Scroll of Thoth, and it's described in this particular way. Quote, if you're right about the legend, then this casket may contain the scroll of Thoth from the Holy of Holies in the temple. And I can hardly wait to get back to find out. The gods of Egypt still live in these hills and their ruined temples. The ancient spells are weaker, but some of them are still potent. And I believe you have in your hut the scroll of Thoth itself, which contains the great spell by which Isis raised Osiris from the dead. Put it back. Bury it where you found it. You have read the curse. Dare you defy it? Now, this presentation of the scroll of Thoth, this ancient text, the film borrowed this from a real designation, right? The scroll of Thoth and its associated magical character. The film took that from a very specific ancient source. That ancient source is an ancient story that we now call the tale of Setna and the mummies. So Setna is the main character's name. The film loosely echoes the elements of this ancient story where the main character, again, a man named Setna, searches out a book of Thoth for its magical power. What you see here on the screen, the story was written in Demotic script on a papyrus of the 2nd century BC in the Ptolemaic period. And in the story, the protagonist Setna is tempted by the scroll. And here's a quote from the story. If you want to read a text, come to me so that I can have you taken to the place where the book is, of which Thoth was the one who wrote it with his own hand himself, when he had come down after the gods. 2 written formulae are on its surface. If you recite the first formula, you will encompass the sky, earth, and neither world. When this text was translated early on, it was often accompanied by illustrations. And here you see illustrations from an 1899. Again, so keep that date in mind, 1899, right? So before the Mummy franchise becomes big, at least in our culture. So illustrations from an 1899 English translation show Setna, the main character here, bringing the scroll out of a tomb, which you see on the left here with the sort of light shining on him, and then also sitting and reading from the scroll on the right-hand side. Now, as Robert Rittner, that professor I mentioned before, who had that Web of Mystery comic on his wall, had pointed out in a publication decades ago, the tale of Setna and the mummies is, quote, the source of the scroll of Thoth, central to the 1932 Universal film The Mummy and its many sequels. Boris Karloff's transformation into an aged Egyptian who leads excavators to the hidden tomb of his ancient love is borrowed directly from the final page of this ancient story. So there are some of these real elements that these writers are cherry picking to build up the mythos behind this character, the mummy. In addition to powerful magic scrolls, a second major trope of the mummy films and mummy stories is the mummy's curse, evoked in the 1932 film as, quote, death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket in the name of Amun-Re, the king of the gods. Good heavens, what a terrible curse. It is this curse, right, that they're speaking of, that animates the plot as the unwitting assistant that we saw earlier reads from the scroll that brings Imhotep back to life. Similar curses, or actually similar stories of curses, spread throughout the Mummy franchise, as in other films like Charlie Chan in Egypt, where you see on the screen, there was a pseudo-hieroglyphic text that was produced for the movie for the curse. Now, the text of this curse is not a real ancient Egyptian text, but it's really interesting because you can see how it was reversed engineered by the screenwriters and the people making the movie. They were looking up English words in an English Egyptian dictionary at the time. This was a dictionary published by a very famous late 19th, early 20th century Egyptologist named E.A. Wallace Budge. And he had published this English Egyptian dictionary. And it's clear that the people who were making this for the movie just looked up the English words and then just stuck in the Egyptian hieroglyphs in here from that very dictionary to create this curse text. So you can actually trace that back. But this idea of the curse then spread throughout the mummy genre. And of course, with the spread of the mummy genre, we see that spread of the curse all the way down to today, where you can, for example, buy the Mummy's Curse self-rising toys. You see here on the left that where the mummy slowly rises out of its own coffin. Or what you see on the right, you can sleep under a bed sheet threatening your children that death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of this king, right? So to leave you alone. And you can even see in the more sort of let's say, fringe side of the media, all manner of things have been blamed on the mummy's curse, including even the sinking of the Titanic. Um, but from ancient Egypt itself, we do know of curses, but not one exactly like a mummy's curse, as these have been written in to these stories and these films. So, just to give you some examples of the ancient material, of course, the most famous account of a supposed ancient Egyptian curse came out of the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922. Most of you have probably heard stories about Lord Carnarvon's unexpected death due to an infection. Ironically, though, King Tut's tomb did not really contain one of these specific curse texts. However, other tombs from ancient Egypt did. You see here a threat on the left side of the screen where the tomb owner threatened to seize him like a bird, or on the right, that a crocodile could be against him in the water or a snake against him on land. And these curses were directed at anyone who might damage the owner's tomb or enter the tomb in any kind of state of impurity. Right. So these texts they tell you sort of at the top, as for anyone who would do anything to this tomb, again, I might seize him like a bird, or a snake will be against him on the land, things like that. With that said, the ancient Egyptians, they did not envision that their mummies would do the deeds on their own. Unlike what the movies may lead you to believe, none of these ancient Egyptian curses assume that the tomb owner's mummified remains are going to get up and start strangling people. So they're not thinking of it in this way that's being presented in the movies. Now, with that said, some of the movie tropes, again, have cherry picked and misinterpreted some ancient evidence. So, for example, we do have references from ancient Egypt to the use of spells for the purpose of black magic, that is, for causing harm to others. One of the most famous examples that we have stems from the trial following the assassination of Pharaoh Ramses III in the 12th century BCE. In the trial documents, one of the plotters, who was part of the conspiracy, is accused of making, quote, writings of magic for enchanting and disturbing. And the charges included making wax, what we might call, quote unquote, voodoo dolls and potions for laming people's limbs. So they were making all this magic paraphernalia to try to influence the conspiracy to kill the king and take his throne. And King Ramses III's mummified remains reveals that the assassination plot was successful, for the king had had his throat cut. And here's our connection back to the Mummy film and the Mummy character. The killers of the king were caught and their plans were revealed. Many of the accused, we now know, were forced to commit suicide as part of their ancient punishment. And it has long been assumed that the mummified remains of a man, which we often call unknown man E, that's who you see on the screen here, that they may have been those of a son of the king, Ramses III, and this person's name was Pentaweret. Now, Pentaweret is key to this plot because his mother is the one who plotted to kill the king in order to install her son on the throne. Now, these remains were found of Pentaweret, this potential son of the king involved in this conspiracy. They were found in 1881. Again, keep those dates in mind, in a royal cache. And you notice here that this particular individual seems to have a sort of agonized expression on his face. Well, a misinterpretation of the agonized expression on his face went on to influence John Balderston's screenplay for that 1932 film. As one of my colleagues, Stuart Smith, has written here, quote, in The Mummy, Imhotep uses magic to attack, paralyze, and bend people to his will. These actions and Imhotep's fate share some similarities with real events in New Kingdom Egypt. Those were the events I was just describing. At least one of the conspirators, probably Ramses III's son Pentaweret, may have been buried alive in an unmarked coffin. Now, again, the reason that they suggest that he may have been buried alive is purely based on the look on the mummy's face. So probably he actually wasn't buried alive. To go back to the quote, this archaeological discovery clearly influenced Balderston's screenplay and had a major impact on the mummy genre, end quote. Therefore, from the loosely adapting and appropriating the above described ancient Egyptian cultural materials, the basic themes of the Mummy franchises formed their origin stories. This included the use of ancient scrolls, Imhotep's powerful magic, the mummy's curse, and even being buried alive, like we see in the movies. So, this is sort of some of the background of how these writers have picked and chosen some elements to throw together into this pot that ends up giving us this mummy character. But what we should do is at least take a brief second now that we've seen some elements of how the pop culture mummy emerged. Let's turn to how ancient Egyptians actually thought about their dead. Much of the inspiration so far described to you is based on misunderstandings, twistings, or outright misrepresentations of ancient Egyptian culture. Despite what we see on the silver screen, ancient Egyptians did not believe that their mummified remains would get up and walk around. Ancient Egyptian ideas about mummification were expressed primarily in an epic mythological cycle focused on the god you see here on the screen, whose name is Osiris. Now, according to these myths, Osiris, who was the king of Egypt, sort of in the mythological period, was murdered by his jealous brother Seth. Seth dismembered Osiris, cast Osiris's body parts into the Nile River, thus scattering them all over Egypt. You can see some of those body parts depicted here in a papyrus showing parts of this Osirian ritual to bring Osiris back together. So after Seth scatters these body parts, it's up to Osiris's family. So Osiris's family is his son Horus, his wife Isis, and sister Nephthys. They take up the responsibility to gather up the body parts and put them back together by wrapping them in linen. So think about this for a second. They're gathering Osiris's body part in the myth. They put them all back together with linen. This offers the mythological precedent for the practice of mummification, right? It offers a story about why the ancient Egyptians want to mummify their dead. So standing on either end of his funerary bed, you see here Isis and Nephthys, the two human-headed birds here, recite spells that then revived Osiris back from the dead. Osiris then awakened and took over his new rulership as king of the dead, while Horus, which you see here in front of Osiris's face, here's Osiris sort of waking up on his funerary bier, while his son Horus ruled on earth. By conquering death, Osiris personified the natural force of regeneration, right? That force that brings plants back every year, that brings the Nile flood every year, that brings the sun up in the morning. So Osiris was a personification of that force. That is, by turning the force into a personality, it allowed the ancient Egyptians to tell stories about it and therefore describe their world, their cultural view of the world. Each ancient Egyptian individual, they wished to imitate this power, right? This power of rejuvenation expressed in the form of Osiris. Moreover, they wanted to be so close to this power that they often took Osiris as part of their identity and incorporated the name Osiris into their names when they had books of the dead, for example, made for them. So it would be like calling me Osiris Foy or Osiris Jane or Osiris John. They said the name Osiris along with theirs because they wanted to partake in this power of rejuvenation. Now, here's part of the key to understanding some differences between the ancient Egyptian conceptions and our modern conceptions. The mummified remains served as each individual's Osirian form. Like Osiris remained in the underworld, so that's after he died, Osiris remained in the underworld, the Osirian mummy of each individual remained in the tomb. It was the human-headed bird known as the Ba, or sometimes we translate it as soul or spirit, and you can see it here on the left-hand side of your screen, flying down the tomb shaft back to the mummy here shown in this papyrus. That Ba represented the ability to travel the world. And the Ba followed the sun on its journey, going through the sky during the day and going through the underworld at night. In the middle of the night, the sun god joined with this god Osiris, the force of rejuvenation, in something that we often call in scholarship the solar Osirian union. That is the union between Osiris and the sun. You can see an example of that union here in this image from the tomb of Nefertari, a very famous image with the explicit text, "It is Re who rests in Osiris and Osiris who rests in Re." You can see that written here around this ram-headed mummy. Um, Now, what that means is the Osirian form served as the symbol of rejuvenation. That is, your mummy served as your symbol of rejuvenation. Whether you were the sun trying to rise up the next morning in the horizon or the soul of a deceased family member, from the ancient perspective, it was necessary to go through Osiris to live again. So the body was preserved as a symbolic, regenerative vessel, but it remained in the tomb. It was the spirit that traveled the realms of the afterlife. The mummy, as the Egyptians understood it, was a sacred body, a necessary anchor for your soul. It was wrapped, it was shrouded, and it was protected within the tomb to ensure that cosmic rebirth. Okay, so that is the ancient Egyptian perspective. But here's the turning point. The ancient Egyptian quote unquote mummy, mummified human remains, once a sacred vessel, becomes in modern hands, right, a figure of horror, exoticism, and fear. All of this then begs the questions: how did we go from Osiris to the mummy of the Hollywood films? And the transformation begins not with Universal Studios, but much earlier, especially during the age of empire, curiosity cabinets, and mummy unwrapping parties. We have to look at the early context of how Egypt was encountered by the West, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. All of this filtered through a larger lens that, as we talked about earlier at the beginning of this talk, we might call Egyptomania, right? So, an obsession sort of with a fascination with ancient Egypt, or in this case, for this talk, we might call mummy mania. When we look at the rediscovery of Egypt by the West, there are several major punctuated events. Number one, high on that list, the 1798 invasion of Egypt by Napoleon, which exponentially transformed access of Europe and the Americas to Egypt. And that access was especially transformed by the publication that came out from the Napoleon expedition, the set of books called The Description of Egypt, which, even if you didn't go to Egypt, that set of books that you could go see or go read, especially when they got published in smaller, cheaper volumes, could allow you to interact and learn about ancient Egypt. Then the second punctuated event, the 1822 decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion, opening up the ancient Egyptian language to us. Number three, the 1922 discovery of King Tut's tomb, which really, again, gave another sort of shot in the arm, so to speak, to Egyptomania, and especially sort of during the Art Deco period. And then in the more modern period, the rise of global tourism to Egypt after 1970. So these aren't the only events, right? And there's stuff that's earlier, but these are just some of the punctuated events that really help to influence the story that I'm trying to communicate to you tonight, this story of how the mummy becomes the character that we know. Now, following the Napoleonic War, the first collections of Egyptian antiquities, including mummified human remains, start to enter the United States. So in 1823, we have a sarcophagus that gets brought to Boston. In 1826, we have several sets of mummified human remains that end up in the possession of none other than P.T. Barnum, thereby reinforcing the sort of sideshow carnival context of these collections. An 1832 collection of Colonel Cohen became part of the Johns Hopkins University. So they have a big Egyptian collection going back to the early 1800s. And we have a very famous episode of a man named Michael Chandler. This was in the 1830s, the mid 1830s, who toured the East Coast and the Midwest with displays of Egyptian antiquities and mummified human remains, a portion of which ended up in the collection of Joseph Smith and influenced the canonical scripture of the Mormon Church. Now, that last bit is a story for another day. We could talk about it in the Q&A a little bit if you want, but it's just to say that this has a very pervasive influence on American culture. There's this really important series of sort of Egyptomania events that have influenced various segments of United States culture. Now, as these early collectors, when we're looking at them, what they sort of demonstrate is that 19th century people with the financial means to travel the world, they would often purchase human remains as a souvenir. Okay. Like they would be bringing these mummified human remains home. This practice reflects the same approach to human remains as shown in that book, The Description of Egypt, that was published out of the Napoleonic expedition. This was this monumental publication following the invasion. In it, what you can see here, this is from the frontispiece on the left. On the right, you see one of the plates that actually was just on display in an exhibit that we had at the ISAC Museum. But on the left, you see the frontispiece, and notice how it displays Egypt. Egypt is shown as a peopleless land filled with objects and antiquities, right? Where are the modern Egyptian cities, the modern Egyptians themselves, etc.? It's shown as this land of things and objects. Included among the volumes in that description of Egypt, the volumes on what were called antiquities, you can see here in the title of the plate, right? Antiquities, included there were graphic drawings of human remains that the people of Napoleon's expedition encountered, including disarticulated body parts. And these drawings weren't just popular then, but they remained popular and were reprinted very often. So, for example, what you see here, 60 years after the description of Egypt, you see this 1887 publication by Samuel Benyon, where the drawings of these human remains were reprinted in a much later book. So the obvious point here that I'm trying to make is that these mummified human remains were being collected, purchased, traded, and treated not as people or as human remains, but as objects, right? And one of the most famous of these individual collectors was a man named Thomas Pettigrew, who earned the nickname Mummy Pettigrew. And he earned that nickname because he became very famous in the UK for his public unwrapping parties, where he would unwrap ancient Egyptian human remains. And these events, they weren't private. They became major social sort of community events where this happened. And you can see some of this. Here on the screen is an advertisement that appeared in 1850 announcing the public, quote unquote, opening of the mummy events, both in Boston and Philadelphia. The advertisement, if you read this closely, you can see it sought subscribers so that the subscribers could contribute enough funds to compensate George Glidden. George Glidden was a vice consul to Egypt, so you can see where he's getting his antiquities. But they wanted to get subscribers so that they could pay him for the expense of his contribution of what's called here, quote, 2 highest class Egyptian mummies for the occasion of the unwrapping. So notice that these were major public events that people were doing this. And these unwrapping parties, they echoed some very, very famous scenes that were coming out of Egypt itself in the 1880s, where Europeans, mostly French at the time, because the French were in charge of the Antiquities Service, they set about unwrapping the bodies of kings and queens who were found in that famous tomb cache. I mentioned this cache earlier when we were talking about Pentaweret and that son of Ramses III. And these scenes, these unwrapping scenes, where these people who were controlling the Antiquities Service, again, largely French at this moment, they were captured in paintings or in drawings that would then appear in the press, right? That showed how these unwrappings were being done. And because of this media, because of the way that these are being presented, these unwrapping parties and depictions of them, not and at this time here, like you see in paintings and drawings, but then also in photography, they almost became set pieces. They became sort of formulaic, showing a cast of characters surrounding a body with occasional ancient objects you can see here to decorate the background, right? So you got to throw in the Egyptian sarcophagus there just to help tell everybody what we're doing. Now, okay, just going to say I'm going to show a couple things here. It's blurred out, so you won't see anything, but I'll just show a couple of images that are showing you how these are sort of formulaic type pieces. Public unwrappings and their posed photographic documentation, it didn't end in the 19th century, and nor were they limited to Egyptology. So you would be forgiven if you thought that the photo you see on the screen was from a mummy unwrapping. But this isn't from a mummy unwrapping. This image is from the Chicago College of Dental Surgery. So looking at this and comparing it to these other images, what it shows you is how these photographs represented a type scene, right? In many ways here, what Egyptologists were doing were simply following the doctors, the dentists, and the other quote unquote scientists in carefully choreographed ways to depict the work of their discipline, right? So compared what's going on here in this dental surgery image with this image, a very famous image of Margaret Murray and a very famous mummy unwrapping. So, like the medical school images, the unwrappings were often couched in the trappings of science and presented as purely scientific endeavors, even when hundreds of public spectators attended, as at Margaret Murray's 1908 event at the University of Manchester that you see here pictured on the screen in this very famous picture. However, here's a very interesting part of this event that's maybe not that well known. One interesting aspect of this particularly famous mummy unwrapping was how it was subsequently depicted in the press. Just look at the characters here on the screen. Note the exact poses and places of the individual in the photo. Here is how that same photo was shown in the press in the Daily Mirror from May 8th, 1908. Notice here, it's the same picture, but what's different? Here, the unwrapped remains have been replaced by an image of the wrapped remains spliced over the top. Okay, so this was Photoshop before Photoshop, right? As one of my colleagues has observed, he wrote that this quote unquote Photoshopping before Photoshop was likely to reflect, quote, a reticence to reproduce unwrapped remains at such a scale in print, right? So basically, what Campbell Price is suggesting, and it seems obvious and right, that they didn't want to show sort of at this size on this page, like sort of right up front, unwrapped human remains. So they cut out another image and pasted over the top. In fact, there was an image of the beginning of the unwrapping before it was the mummy was unwrapped, the human remains were unwrapped, and that's where they took this image and spliced it over the top. Now, even though this happened in this particular publication, plenty of other newspapers at the time didn't seem to have any qualms about showing unwrapped remains or unwrapping parties. In that same name of science, similar unwrappings, although generally without the large audience that you might have had in the Manchester, were taking place all over, including here in Chicago at museums in the early 20th century. And that's what you see here from the early 20th century, unwrapping some of these ancient Egyptian human remains. And it hasn't completely gone away. Even to this very day, you can go on YouTube right now and you can view videos of public unwrappings of ancient Egyptian human remains, like the one that you see on the screen that was conducted by Rosalie David at the University of Manchester, another Manchester one, on a body known only as Manchester Mummy 1770. A colleague of mine, Kathleen Shepard, has noted that unwrappings such as those of Margaret Murray that we just saw and David here on the screen, they aptly illustrate how the lines between, let's say, scientific authority and public spectacle were blurred, right? These were sort of framed as education, but on the other hand, these events like fed a public appetite for the morbid and the exotic, an appetite that was born not from ancient Egyptian ideals or ancient Egyptian ideas, but from, basically a Western voyeurism. We can actually connect this to the book that we're all talking about for these programs, right? The Stolen Queen. In The Stolen Queen, the mystery revolves around a vanished Egyptian artifact and people who claim to own it. While, the novel shows this tension between, on the one hand, scholarly stewardship and on the other hand, personal obsession. But that tension mirrors what we see in these 19th century quote unquote mummy unwrappings, events that turned ancient individuals into a public spectacle. Now, a colleague of mine, Christina Riggs, has pointed out how these quote unquote scientific endeavors represent approaches to this ancient cultural material that are diametrically opposed to those of the ancient Egyptians themselves. So, as Christina points out, quote, the materiality of wrapping thus encompasses much more than the pieces of linen placed around bodies and objects. It parallels the role of restricted knowledge and space in Egyptian society and reverberates with a system of decorum that valued refinement in bodily adornment and gesture, the literal and symbolic layering of inscribed and decorated surfaces in representational art, and the creation and replication of order. So she summarized this by saying wrapping mattered, right? That it was a sacred activity. It made things secret. In her analysis, she shows how wrapping in ancient Egypt created a sense of this secrecy, the sacrality, and specialness. Bodies were wrapped and placed in darkened, inaccessible tomb chambers. But what does modern science do? Modern science requires bringing these out into the light to unwrap them to make them seen again. So, in her words, in Christina words, quote, but as excavated objects destined for museums or a reburial for tourists to view, what linked them was their unwrapping. It equalized them as things fit for collection, study, and display, ultimately turning things into objects, antiquities, artworks, and artifacts. What was wrapped was secret and set apart. What was unwrapped could be handled, documented, seen, and known, end quote. So obviously the implication here is that the motivation of the ancient Egyptian practice and the motivations of the scientific disciplines are completely at odds with each other, right? The ancient Egyptians were doing one thing, and sort of as scientists, we're sort of doing, in a way, the exact opposite. Another colleague of mine, Angela Stein, has documented this kind of objectification that is turning people into objects on her website, Mummy Stories, and now in her book called Mummified. In her work, Stein has traced our treatment of ancient Egyptian remains back through time, looking at the ethical questions it raises along the way. And she covers in this one of the most disturbing trends in objectification that gave us the very word mummy itself. Okay, so even our use of the term mummy comes from this objectifying practices of earlier times. For example, the word mummy, which from which the character obviously in the movies derives his designation, the word mummy derives from the term mumia. This term has a long history, but it was used in Arabic to describe both the black pitch of bitumen as well as embalmed and mummified human remains. Now, you might be wondering, why? Why would they use the term mumia for this? Well, the reason a word for bitumen was applied to mummified bodies was because the ancient Egyptians often used a black resin as part of the embalming process. Now, this black resin was made from a mix of animal fat, plant oil, and bitumen, and then the resin was applied as the symbolic substance of Osiris, right, representing the fertility of the Black Nile soil. So you can see on some of the examples on the screen that this black bitumen was poured all over these bodies because it had that bitumen on it. Then people started calling these bodies mumia, right, after the word for black pitch or bitumen. So later in the late medieval period, so after 1200, into the 1500s, 1600s, from roughly the 12th to the 17th century, there was a product produced. Pay attention here. There was a product produced from powdered remains of ancient Egyptian bodies, and it was sold and taken, that is, consumed as a medicinal cure-all or even an aphrodisiac. Yes, you heard that correctly. For approximately 500 years, people were consuming mumia as an elixir to cure their aches and pains. Kind of mind-blowing, right? When you think about the literalness of what's going on here. After the cure of mumia was proven to be ineffective, that did not stop these kinds of practices. The ground remains of ancient Egyptians continued to be used for a famous color of paint known as mummy brown, here referenced in the newspaper headline that you can see on the screen, quote, "Good mummies make good paint," end quote. And note that the byline states that, quote, "The business of pulverizing defunct Egyptians may cease for lack of supply." It's pretty brutal to think about reading that byline in a newspaper, but you can again see the approach to these ancient Egyptian remains at the time. Now, you might think that this is sort of ancient history and that, this is in the long forgotten past, but there's been people who have followed up on this story, and Mummy Brown, this paint that people call Mummy Brown, continued to be sold right up through the late 20th century, here shown in tubes labeled simply as Mummy. And some people who have done some work on this in an article by Lauren Brown, she talked to members of the color making firm Robertson and Company, who were quoted in 1964, not ancient history, 1964, as stating that, quote, "The last tube," that is the last tube of Mummy Brown, "was made in 1964. The firm stated we might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere," he apologized, but not enough to make any more paint. We sold our last complete mummy some years ago, I think, for £3. Perhaps we shouldn't have. We certainly can't get any more. It goes on. According to Brown, a representative from the company recalls seeing mummy parts in the shop as late as the 1980s when the company was bought out. And here's what the representative said: "There's no more Mummy Brown around," he confirms. This shocking statement that Mummy Brown paint was being made up until 1964 and that mummy parts within the shop were seen up until the 1980s demonstrates the extent of the paint's use and furthers the argument that the discussion of ethics surrounding Egyptian mummified remains is significantly recent. The modern color close to mummy can either have a red, yellow, or purple tinge. Because of this, this modern color has been known as mummy violet, end quote. So you can see what Brown has turned up by looking into this. That is, people were still making mummies into paint as recently as the 1980s. So this, okay, what I just described to you then is part of the story of how we get the character known as the mummy. We start with a loose association with death. We combine that with centuries of objectification, whereby ancient individuals were seen as objects to be collected, studied, and consumed, not just figuratively, but also literally. You combine those with the notions of an exoticizing of ancient Egypt, seeing Egypt as a homeland of magic and wonder, which goes back to ancient Egypt itself. Think about that also in terms of the ruthless pillaging of Egyptian antiquities that exposed ancient Egypt to the world like never before again, from 1800 on, you might say. So that complicated backstory fueled the explosion of mummy-related literary tales at the beginning of the 19th century that largely present the mummy as a character as a monstrous, often nameless, and faceless character. So we have all of that coming up, and then we have these literary stories, not already about a century before the films that we get, but building all of this up prior to what you see in the movies. So following the Napoleonic invasion, increased exposure to ancient Egypt, along with the objectifying treatment of Egyptian antiquities we've talked about, dozens of tales focused on reanimated Egyptian bodies flooded the market. These include examples written by very famous authors that you know, such as Edgar Allan Poe or Arthur Conan Doyle. And again, you can just see a list of some of these on the screen and the dates when they were written to show you how this is developing across that 19th century. Just to show you a very quick example of a couple of these, the first of these tales was written by Jane Webb in a novel from 1827 that was simply called The Mummy! And Webb's story, this is where this gets very important. She married the idea of an ancient Egyptian mummy to the Victorian Gothic, right? So she paved that way for what was to come by marrying this sort of genre with the Egyptian mummy. Taking her lead from Mary Shelley, Webb's mummy was reanimated using galvanism, that is, applying electricity to the body in a manner similar to that of Shelley's Frankenstein. Also using galvanism, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a very satirical and sort of lampooning short story that was called Some Words with a Mummy. In it, he actually uses those public unwrappings that we described that was going on in his day to set the scene. So here's how he says this, quote, "Come to me by all means, my dear good friend, as soon as you receive this. Come and help us rejoice. At last, by long persevering diplomacy, I have gained the assent of the directors of the city museum to my examination of the mummy. You know the one I mean. I have permission to unswath it and open it if desirable." End quote. So notice here that Poe is using these unwrappings to sort of set the scene of the whole story. Then Poe also invokes electricity as the galvanizing factor to reanimate his story's mummy. There was a man named Théophile Gautier. He also wrote a series of short stories and novels influenced by mummy mania. One of the earliest was The Mummy's Foot. It was first published in French in 1840. An English translation came along in 1871. But the story centers around antiquities collecting, and the main protagonist of the story purchases an ancient Egyptian mummified foot. Of course, Gautier's crux, this purchase of the foot, reflects the trade in human remains of his time. But that trade has left its indelible mark in thousands of disarticulated body parts found within museum collections all around the world today. And in fact, the market for these human remains continues actively to this day. You can still see major institutions sort of buying and selling ancient Egyptian human remains on the market. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these stories, but I just wanted to mention, like, it was these stories coming out of that time period that spawned a massive mummy industry in literature, novellas, short stories, pulp fiction, screenplays, scripts, and movies. All of these fed that public appetite for all things Egyptian and served as the background for the mummy character that we know today, that we sort of started this talk with. So, as knowledge and exposure to ancient Egypt blossomed in the 19th century, appropriations from the ancient past were fused with these influences from the present. So, when we look at the mummy of the 1932 film, we see like this kaleidoscopic amalgam of themes from the Tale of Setna we talked about, the events of the Ramesses III that we mentioned, the Victorian Gothic genre, the mummy stories of the 1800s, the mummy's curse of King Tut's tomb, the objectifying collecting practices, this exoticizing gaze of Egyptomania, the mythologizing of scientific progress, all of these things, even misappropriations of Egyptology itself, all combined together to sort of produce this character, to produce these films. So this is the backstory to the creation of this pop culture icon we know as the mummy, this universal faceless monster figure that gives substance to our fears of the unknown. Now, Antonia Lant has written about a film theorist named Andre Bazin, who once suggested that all cinema was rooted in a quote unquote mummy complex. This was described as a desire to preserve life by embalming it in images. But in pop culture, the literal mummy becomes the figurative foundation of cinema's sort of uncanny pull on us, right? Nameless, faceless, the mummy character reflects the sort of Victorian era's literal disarticulation and visual anonymizing of the ancient dead to contribute to the genre's sort of archetype, right? It's using that then to sort of reflects more on us than it reflects on ancient Egypt. And Fiona Davis is picking this up too. In The Stolen Queen, Fiona Davis reminds us that behind every artifact lies a human story, one that can be lost, stolen, or reclaimed, as the protagonists in her book are doing. Just as her characters rediscover the truth behind a vanished Egyptian queen, we too can reclaim the ancient Egyptians from the myths that turned them into monsters. So, things to remember about what we're talking about this talk today, some conclusions. In ancient Egypt, the mummified dead were vessels of rebirth. In modern media, they've been turned into monsters, stripped of meaning, animated by largely our fears. But by unraveling the layers of linen of this story of spectacle, we begin to see not just the mummy, but ourselves, right? How we imagine the past, how we fear it, how we reshape the past to serve our present. The mummy is not the character you probably think he is, right? Beyond an initial inspiration, it has little connection to ancient beliefs or practices, and it's mostly an invention of the 19th and 20th centuries, largely within a European and American context, where we had sort of a superficial engagement with ancient Egypt that produced a whole wealth of misinterpretations. So that objectification of ancient mummified human remains as nameless and even faceless quote unquote mummies paved the way for the mummy to become a nameless and faceless monster. That is, the treating of ancient human remains as less than people primed us to accept a mummy character that is, think about this, the mummy character is at the same time supranatural and subnatural, right? It has these powers, but it's also less than human in some ways, right? So, simply put, when we think about the mummy as a character, that character is as much a colonial and sort of archaeological artifact as the mummified human remains that served as his inspiration. The tropes around curses and reanimation and magic scrolls, they don't really reflect ancient beliefs, but rather sort of project our own anxieties about, scientific hubris, colonial guilt, cultural transgression, etc. What we tend to call, nowadays politely mummified human remains, the ancient Egyptians would have called them their ancestors, right? Through their flesh, they would have seen Osirian vessels, symbolic of their spiritual life, because they did not believe in the physical reanimation of the body that the mummy character suggests to you. So, understanding the mummy as a pop culture construction shaped by colonialism and objectification, it invites us to rethink not just movie monsters, but also how we treat physical remains and cultural heritage of the past. So, this year, this month, in a few weeks, when you unwrap that mummy themed Halloween candy or binge watch a monster flick, take a moment to consider whose fears the image, the stories, and those movies are feeding, and ask yourself at whose expense. Thank you very much.
Wow, boy, mind blown over here. That was incredible. Let's get into some questions. So if everyone is like me, they're probably still thinking about some, but we do have some in the chat. So just want to let everyone know, please put any questions you have for Foy here in the chat. I'm going to start with Carol's question here. Um, I think this had to do with the unwrappings. Didn't they sometimes do mummy unwrappings as a way to get money to go back to Egypt so that they could do more work?
Sure. So they were using these events to raise money for all different sorts of things, not just to go back to Egypt, but for their institutions, for their ongoing work, for their academic work, et cetera. So yeah. I mean, even as you saw in the one advertisement that I showed you, they were using these things just to sort of pay for the quote unquote antiquities themselves, right? So that they could reimburse the people for doing it. But yes, some of this was done also to raise money in other capacities for this type of work. But it's just to say, I should also just say too, I mean, I did mention it, especially when we're talking about the early collections coming to America. But this again was purchasing human remains from Egypt was like one of the main tourist things you did. It was one of your main souvenirs. If you were a person of wealth, late 19th, early 20th century, this was just common. I mean, we even have, for example, the founder of our institute. His name was James Henry Breasted, and he took his wife. This is a longer story, but he took his first wife on a honeymoon. They went immediately to Egypt, and we have her diary. And of course, on the one hand, she's always talking about how her husband's off always working, copying inscriptions and things like that. But one of the things she describes is that they bought a collection of mummies while they were there. And she said, we put them under the bed on our boat and we did not lose a wink of sleep. Right. So, like, this was just common at the time as part of this tourist trade.
Gotcha. And I'm with Cassandra here, the consuming mummies part. So like that kind of blew my mind because, if I mean, you think about the trade of human bodies and body parts and that sort of thing, as if that wasn't dehumanizing enough. Now we're consuming them. I mean, wow.
No, it is a mind blowing thing to think about. And again, that you can go back and look at this late medieval accounts of this, and people are sort of accusing each other, like you didn't get the real good stuff, you got the fake mumia, right? And you didn't get the real good stuff. But it's also, it's not just being used in that way, it's being used for all sorts of things. So I didn't put the slide in this particular talk, but we see things, for example, again, late 19th century, there are cartoons that are put out sometimes around Halloween in the newspapers at the time, where it says something like, the curse of the farmer's fields, and it has all of these cat mummy ghosts coming to like haunt the farmer because they took mummified remains, not just of humans but also Egyptians mummified many animals too, and they would spread them on the fields for fertilizer, right? So these remains were being used in a lot of different ways. And of course, yes, the practice of actually consuming them as like an elixir, combined with the practice of making them into paint, is some of the, when you first learn about that, it is some of the most mind-blowing, sort of shocking aspects of the fascination with ancient Egypt. Yeah. And then again, I very highly recommend a couple of books if you want to know more about all of this stuff. The book by Christina Riggs, Unwrapping Ancient Egypt, is really great to give you sort of a critical perspective. But then if you want to know more about sort of the treatment of mummified human remains, Angela Stein's book, Mummified, is a really nice, accessible overview. And she covers, at least short, it's not, she doesn't dwell on it, but she does cover mumia and its background in there.
Right. I mean, I know that this is getting into a big thing too, but I'm kind of with Donna as well, and maybe we'll have to have you back. But if you could give us a brief overview, Donna asks, definitely interested in how mummified remains influence the Mormon Church.
Okay, I'll give you a very brief overview, and then you can go on a complete internet wormhole because you can spend many years looking this stuff up. But so that guy Michael Chandler that I mentioned, it's a sort of long, complicated story. But he came into possession of an Egyptian collection. Some people think he sort of stole it from this Italian guy. Some other people think that he was related to this Italian guy. But he gets this collection and he's touring around and he's taking around. He's trying to make money off it. So he's showing these mummies, and inside the mummy wrappings were also papyri. So, Book of the Dead papyri, things like that we know today. And he was showing these around in New York, and then he came down through Ohio, Kirkland, Ohio, these areas, and he was showing this stuff. And at some point, he sort of gets wind that there's this guy who can read ancient texts, right? We're talking about Joseph Smith. He's in Ohio, Smith's in Ohio. And long story short, the Smith family buys a small collection of mummies and the papyri that were with the mummies. Joseph Smith claims to translate one of these papyri. That translation from that papyrus is today still part of the Mormon scripture in a book called The Pearl of Great Price, in the Book of Abraham. So this translation, that now keep in mind, this is the like around 1835. Nobody in America knew how to read hieroglyphs yet. Right, it's still too early. Hieroglyphs were just deciphered in 1822, so that knowledge hadn't spread here yet. So, um, the way to think about this, or the way to explain this, is that Joseph Smith, had sort of a spiritual inspiration of a translation. It wasn't actually a translation. And what happened is then those papyri disappeared. So nobody could kind of verify what they were. But if you look in the Book of Abraham and the Pearl of Great Price, there are drawings that Joseph Smith made from sections of these papyri. So we knew that they were real ancient Egyptian texts. Lo and behold, in the 1970s, those papyri were rediscovered, the actual ones that Joseph Smith owned, in the basement of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They were immediately sent to Egyptologists where? At the University of Chicago. Thank you very much. They translated them. They showed that the English translation sort of had nothing to do with Joseph Smith's translation. So you have to sort of take that as a spiritual translation, right? And that's different from what we said. So they have nothing to do with each other. But again, that's still part of our culture today. And I'll just say, that's sort of a rough overview. As you might imagine, there are some people who are on very extreme ends of poles about what they think about what those mean and what texts were in there and all that kind of stuff. But that's how it happened. So Joseph Smith did have real ancient Egyptian papyri and real mummies. As far as we know, most of the mummies were destroyed, presumably in the Great Chicago Fire. So after the family had sold them off, after the death of Joseph Smith, generation later or so later, many of them got destroyed, although some people have been trying to track these things around. Some may have ended up in Canada, but we don't know for sure. But the papyri were found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then the Metropolitan Museum of Art gave those papyri back to the LDS Church, where they remain today.
Wow. Yeah, I'm going to go down that wormhole tonight. Thanks
Oh,
for it. Ruined a night of sleep for me.
it's a super fascinating story. I mean, if you can see my email on the screen. If you guys want more reading on that, shoot me an email. I can send you some bibliography. There's some really interesting books. And in fact, my former professor, Robert Rinder, he wrote a book where he did a re-edition of all of the Joseph Smith papyri. So the book is just called The Joseph Smith Papyri. But that's sort of a technical scholarly work. I wouldn't recommend it just for a popular audience.
We got a couple more here. The mummy foot, exclamation point from Mary. Did embalming help preserve it? Maybe there's something here that, with yeah, how did it stay so
Yeah, so of course they would have embalmed the whole body, right? And there's different parts that we don't have time right now to go through a full explanation, but a big part of that was like drying it out with natron salt. And so once it was dry, and in Egypt, there's very little rain, and if you put it in the right spot, like it'll stay preserved. But for a variety of factors, what often happened, and this already happened in ancient Egypt itself, right, is that a lot of these tombs were raided for the goods that were in them, for the valuable items. So even already in ancient Egypt, ancient Egyptians, right, were violating their own ancestors' graves to get the goodies. And in fact, there's this period around the end of the New Kingdom, beginning of the Third Intermediate period. The priest at the time, actually, they draw up these documents, and they it's really interesting, but they tell us, like, we went through all the necropolis because we had heard that people were breaking into the royal tombs, and they go through the necropolis and check. So we have this list where they tell us, like, we checked this tomb and it was okay. We checked this tomb, it was plundered, right? And so then what the priests do, They gather up all the royal mummies that they know at the time and they hide them away in a secret cache. That's where they're found in the 1880s that I showed you earlier. However, the priest very conveniently did not rebury them with all their goodies. So the priest very conveniently, even though they sort of presented this as a pious act, right? Well, we're going to gather up all the bodies of the kings and queens and put them safely away. Well, they also took all the goodies from them at the same time. So again, already in ancient Egypt, some of that pillaging was happening, but then of course that happens all across the millennia up until the present day. And when these people were trying to get at things that were valuable and they were sort of ripping the bandages and stuff off, that's where like you would damage the human remains. And that's why you have a lot of these pieces of human bodies that end up in museum collections all over the world because people were then collecting them as, again, antiquities or objects, souvenirs, if you can believe it, when they were going to Egypt on quote unquote the grand tour, right? So they would, go to Europe, go to Egypt. This was just part of what you did as a family. It's kind of hard to imagine this as like the Disneyland of the day, but in a way it sort of is. And so that's why those human remains are still well preserved, right? Is from that ancient embalming.
Wow, interesting. Got two more here. This is from Mary, and I think you kind of got into this a little bit, but maybe we can go a little bit further. Mary asks, "What is the reaction of Egyptians to the trade in mummified human remains?"
Sure. I mean, the thing is there's not one answer to that, right? Just like any people, you're going to have a diversity of views on it. And some of those, and I should also say it's not just the Egyptians, but like even for Westerners, it's not like all Westerners celebrated this, right? Like we have accounts already in the 1830s from American senators who were writing at the time and saying, like, what's happening in Egypt is a great disgrace. Okay, so it's just to say that there's a variety of views on this in all these cultures. So we know, for example, that there was absolute outrage from Egyptians about some of this, and we know that because there were a number of rebellions in Egypt against the colonial powers who were ruling it at the time. So either the French at one period or the British at another period. And they were trying to gain control of their cultural heritage because, again, remember those paintings that I showed you where they're unwrapping these royal mummies? That was mostly, Western, French or British, generally, sometimes American, but often French or British, or sometimes from other European powers, the Netherlands and things like that. But they were the ones who were in charge of the antiquities service. So the Egyptians were trying to get in charge of their own, right, their own cultural heritage. And it took a long time. So today, there's two things to think about. The trade in mummified human remains. I mean, first off, it's completely illegal, right? You can't take anything out of Egypt anymore, any of that kind of stuff. The Egyptians are protecting their cultural heritage like that. But I should also say those human remains in Egypt are celebrated, right, as the great legacy of their culture. So just to give you an example, not too long ago, last year or the year before, they were moving some of the human remains of these kings and queens from ancient Egypt to another museum. And it was done at a huge level. There was a parade and the state fanfare, and they sort of marched them through the streets, and there were singers and dancers. So they were sort of celebrating this cultural heritage. I mean, I don't want to speak for the Egyptians themselves. That's sort of not my job, but I'll just say that, yeah, that's what we can see today. It's like, yeah, there was definitely opposition to it. And now today, I mean, it's nobody sees this as something that's that was okay, if you want to put it colloquially.
Oh no, that's fascinating too. Like it's kind of nice to know that some of our senators were speaking out against this all the way back then. That's
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that we should acknowledge, right? Is that even when we're being critical and looking at the practices that were very common, it's not we still don't want to give a sweeping generalization and just like think everybody did that, right? It's not like everybody was taking mumia and these beer, right? But this is just something that did happen. It was fairly popular. It was widespread. But there's always a diversity of these viewpoints.
great. Okay, we've got one more here from Keelan. Beyond the Photoshop, were there any contemporary? Oh, I guess this kind of gets into a little bit, but were there any contemporary denouncements of these practices?
Yeah, I mean the short answer is yes, like we sort of just said. So yeah, there were people who were celebrating it. There were people who were sort of indifferent to it. And yes, there were people who were coming out and saying, like, what are we doing? Like, we shouldn't be doing this. And even again, like that recent one that I showed where that you can go watch on YouTube, this unwrapping from like the 70s, that created a lot of controversy and is still controversial to this day. And in fact, many of the museums where this was being practiced, let's say 30, 40, 50 years ago, they won't even put human remains on display anymore, right? Out of sort of ethical and moral reasons. Or if there's anything on display, though, they would cover it like in a shroud and stuff. So, things have really changed in our approach to this stuff in the last like 35 to 40 years, especially.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think that's it, Foy. I do want to thank you again for two fabulous programs with us. This has been incredibly fascinating. And I want to thank all of our audience too for joining us. This has been wonderful. So, thank you again, Foy.
Yeah,
I love
thank you.
when you come and talk. It's so
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Thanks for everybody for coming.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Take care. Happy Halloween too, I guess, and happy
Exactly.
One Village coming up just before that. Have a great night. Bye.